So we're almost finished with the basics of JavaScript, but there's still one thing missing that's crucial to programming in general, and that is loops. So in the lecture where I first introduced you to the if-else statement, I mentioned that it was just one of many control structures. And so here are some more control structures: loops. So loops are a very important aspect of any programming language. Just imagine that you have a very repetitive task. Instead of writing, like, for example, 10 lines of the same code, you would just use a loop. So you can basically automate repetitive tasks using loops. Okay, and there are different types of loops in JavaScript, and we will start with a simple for loop. So suppose we needed to print the numbers from 0 to 9. Okay, so something like console.log and then 1. And then 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on and so forth. So you would have to do this 10 times, but that's not a good idea at all, right? And so instead, again, we use a loop. And I'm going to start with a for loop. So we write for, and then the for loop has 3 parts. It has the initial value of a counter, a condition that is evaluated before each loop iteration, and finally a counter update after each iteration. Okay, so let's go through them one by one. So the first part is the initial value of a counter. So imagine that we want to print from 0 to 9. Okay, and so we start at 0. And so we define a variable called I, for example, and set it to 0. And I use I here because I is kind of a standard in JavaScript for a counter variable. Okay, so this is the variable that will be updated in every loop. Okay, then we use the semicolon. And now the second part. So this is a condition that is evaluated before each loop iteration in order to see if the next loop should still be executed. So if we want to count from 0 to 9, well, then our condition will be that I should be less than 10. Okay, so only if this turns out to be true, then the next loop will actually run. Okay, so in the beginning we start with 0, and so I will be 0, and 0 is less than 10. And so it's true, and so the loop will start. All right? And then next up, and finally, we have the counter update after each iteration. So if we want to count from 0 to 9, like 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the numbers, then in each iteration, we want to increase I by 1. Okay? And remember a special operator to do that. It is the ++. Okay? So this is the same as writing I equals I plus 1. Remember that? Okay, and then in here we have basically the loop block. So what should happen in each of the loops? And in this small example, all we want to do is to really log these numbers to the console. So console.log I. And so that's it. That's really it. Let's take a look. And so now here you see all of these 10 numbers from 0 to 9. All right, so let's go through it again and see why this works. So I'm adding a comment here and try to write out what happens in each iteration. So we start and I will be 0, right? Then the condition is evaluated, and so 0 is of course less than 10, and so that's true. And so we will then log I to the console. So log I to console. And then finally at the end, the counter is updated. Okay, and so I ++. Okay, then in the next iteration, we will have I is already 1 at this point, right? And so the test is now I less than 10, which is still true. And so the next iteration will start. And so again, we log I to the console, and then I will be incremented by 1. So we do that a couple of times until we reach the end. Okay, so let's actually copy this here. And again, this is just to show you how this works. So this happens a couple of times until we're at a point where I is 9 already. And so, and here I wanted actually the less symbol. Okay, and so at this point we are at 9, and 9 is still less than 10, and so it's true. Then we log the I to the console, and I gets incremented just like before. Okay, but then it means that at the next step we are at 10. And so 10 less than 10 is now false. And so we enter the loop. We exit the loop. which means that the loop finishes and it no longer continues working. Okay, and so that's why we stop at 9. All right, does that make sense? Now we could of course change some stuff here. So imagine that we wanted to count until 20. So we couldn't put 20. Actually, this will go until 19. Or imagine that we wanted to really start from 0 and include the 20. So we wanted to start from 1, not 0, sorry. So starting from 1, and we wanted to include the 20. So we can say less or equal, right? And so in this case, this will only fail as soon as I is 21. And so we start at 1 and go all the way to 20. And we can also add like a step here. So instead of simply adding 1, we can add 2 in each iteration. So let's try that. So instead of doing I++, we can do I plus equal 2. Okay, and remember, that's the same as writing I equals I plus 2. Let's check it now. And so indeed, it works. So we start with 1, right? And then we increase the counter by 2. And so the next one will be 3, right? And then 5, and so on and so forth, all the way to 19. And 20 is not included because 19 plus 2 is already 21, which is, of course, greater than 20. All right, so that is the very basic functionality of the for loop. Now let's look at a bit more practical example. So let's say that we have an array here, and let's actually copy the array from the array lecture here. And where is it? So yeah, this one is the one that I mean, so the John array, instead of having to write it out all over again. So we have a couple of data here about John. So let's say that we have an app where we need to display these 5 values here to the console. Well, maybe not to the console, but to the user interface, but we're just working with the console here. And so let's pretend that we need to log these 5 values here to the console. And so of course, just like before, we could do it like this. So John 0, and then like all the way to 5, oh, actually to 4, right? So we could do it like this, right? So that would solve the problem, but not in a good way. So imagine that we had actually 50 elements in this array and not just 5. So what would you do then? You couldn't just create 50 lines of the same code. And so of course, the solution here is to use a loop. So let's get rid of this here and instead write it as a loop. So again, a for loop. So var I equals 0. And why do we start at 0? Well, we start at 0 because the array is 0 based. And what we want to use the counter here is to read the element of the array at position 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. All right, so we start at 0, and we want the loop to run as long as I is less than the length of the array. Okay, and why is that? Well, it's because the length of this array is 5, and so as long as the counter is below 5, so 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4, we can then read the data out of this array. But starting at 5, there's no more data in the array. So there's nothing at position 5 in the John array, and so at 5, we no longer want to read anything. So remember how we can read the length of an array, so the number of elements? Well, all we have to do is to use the length property. Okay, and then we want to read all of them, and so we do plus plus just like before. All right, so this here will maybe not make 100% sense to you, but it will after you see exactly what we're going to do here in the block of this loop. Okay, so what we're going to do is to log to the console John at position I. Okay, so instead of writing out 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4, we let the loop take care of basically putting the numbers here. So in the first one, it will be 0, and then 1, and then 2, and then 3, and then 4. But not 5, because John.length is 5, and this loop only runs as long as the counter is less than 5 in this case. Okay, so let's test it out. And yeah, here we go. So all of these 5 logs are now coming from line 597, so this line here. So does this logic here make sense to you? Just to make sure, let's do it again. So we need this counter variable here, I. In order to log to the console, John 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. So we want all of these 5 elements to be logged to the console. And instead of having to write out John 1, John 2, John 3, John 4, and John 5, we just use this loop. And so we start at 0 because that's the first element in our array. After each iteration of the array, we increase the counter value by 1 because we want to read all of the 5 values. And finally, we run this loop as long as the counter variable is still smaller than the total length of the array, which is 5. So it will run for 0, for 2, for 3, for 4, but no longer for 5, because there's nothing at position 5. And we could, of course, manually have put it here with a 5, but then imagine that we would add something here. So something like blue as a favorite color, and well, then it would not dynamically change the array. So if we now reloaded, it would not display the blue here to the console. But instead, if we go back and put it to john.length, well, then it will automatically figure out the length and then loop through the entire array. Because now john.length is 6, and so it will also loop the element number 5 of the array. So indeed, now it appeared down here, the blue as well. Okay, so I hope that now it's crystal clear to you. And looping through arrays is actually one of the biggest use cases for loop. So this one is really important to understand. Now there are actually even better ways and also simpler ways of achieving it without using this specific for loop. But once more, let's talk about that a bit later, because that's a bit more of a complex topic. And for now, we're just really looking at the fundamentals. So that was the for loop, but there's also another type of loop in JavaScript, and that's the simple while loop. So let's try to replicate the same functionality here with the while loop. So the difference between the for and the while is that in while we only have the condition. So all we have to pass into the while loop is really this part. So we can say that while I is less than john.length, then it should keep executing this code. Okay, so basically this logging functionality here. And so if you want to have the exact same functionality as with the for loop here, we first would have to start by defining the variable out here. So I equals 0, and then at the end of each loop, we will have to increment I. Okay, and so that's actually it. So this here is now the exact same thing as this for loop here. But of course, it's much easier to just use the for loop here. Okay, I just wanted to let you know that there's also a way of doing it with the while loop. So let's add some comments here. So this is the while loop, and well, this here is the for loop. All right, and now I just want to show you the continue and the break statements. So we use the break statement in order to break out of a loop, and we use continue in order to quit the current iteration of the loop and continue with the next one. Okay, so let's just take a look at a couple of quick examples. And I think I didn't even show you the result of this one. So just to make sure, and now it is, well, now we have all of this here, but you see that it's just the same. So we have these 6 here coming from the for loop, and we have these 6 here coming from the while loop at line 604, right? And so in fact, it works just the same way. Now let's actually get rid of these here. Not really get rid, but I'm just going to comment them out so that they're not getting in my way for the next part. All right, so let's copy this here so that I can now show you the continue and the break statements. And let's start with the continue. So again, the continue, we use it to quit just the current iteration of the loop and then continue right to the next one, okay? So let's say, for example, that we only wanted to log elements that are strings, okay? And so we can implement a logic that will do it so that if it's not a string, it will quit the current iteration and then continue with the next one, all right? So how do we check if it is actually a string? Well, remember the type of operator that we used right in the beginning of this section. So we can now say type of, and I think I misspelled that, so type of John at the current position. So if this one is different from a string, and I think we haven't used different up until this point. So we only ever used the equal, But now I don't want equal, I want different. And different, we use the exclamation mark like this. So this here is the strict different operator. And just like with the triple and the double equals, here we also have the normal different operator and then the strict different operator like this. And just like with the equality, we should always use this one. Here we always should use this one. So exclamation mark and then equal equal. Okay, and so this means different. So what we want to do here is that each time that the type of the current element is different from a string, well, we just want to continue. Okay, and I think this is also something new. I think that up until this point, we always did the if like this. So we had this block and then, well, kind of the text in there, just like this, okay? But if it's only like on one line and just a simple if statement like this, we can actually do it in one line without the curly braces and just write it like this. So if this, then continue. And so this will then break out of the loop and we'll continue to the next one. So for example, when we hit Smith here, then the type of John I will be string. And string is not different from string, right? And so we will not continue. Instead, we will go straight to this line. But in the next iteration, when it's 1990, well, that is then different from a string. And so therefore, we will enter the if part here, and we will then continue. And so this line here will not even get executed. All right, so let me show that to you. And indeed, we now only have John Smith, designer in blue. It skipped the 1990 and also the false. And again, that's because the type of these two is different than string. So different here, different than string. All right, so that is continue. And now let's do something similar for break. But the difference with break is that it exits the current iteration and the entire loop as well. So it doesn't continue to the next iteration, all right? And so now this time, let's say that we only want to print until we encounter something that is different from a string. Okay, so as soon as we hit something that is not a string, we will not print anything else, all right? Let's simply replace this one here with break. Well, I could have just done it up here, but yeah, so this way we have both versions, all right? I'm just going to, I'm going to leave it like this. So let's now reload, and you see that these four here are from the other loop, so from line 615, and now from line 620, which is this one here, we only have John and Smith. Okay, and so that's exactly what we were looking for. So it prints this string, then this string, and then it encounters something that is not a string, and so it breaks out of the loop and doesn't print anything else from there. Okay, so that is how continue and break work. I hope that makes sense to you, okay? All right, and now just to finish, I want to give you a small challenge. Imagine that we wanted to loop through the John array here, so this one here, the other way around. So starting from blue, then false, designer, and then all the way to John. So how can we solve that? How can we loop through the array the other way around using a for loop? So do you think you can solve that? You can try to pause the video here and give it a second and try it out for yourself, okay? So did you figure it out? So let's add a comment here before we do it. Looping backwards. And really all we have to do here is to think where we want our counter to start, what the condition should be, and what we want to happen with the counter variable. So starting with I, what do we want I to be in the beginning? Well, we have this John array, give it some space here, and we have 6 elements in here, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. All right, and we want to start at element number 5, right? And so what is this 5? Well, it's just the length of this entire array minus 1. Okay, and so let's write exactly that. John.length minus 1. Okay, and that will be 5 in this case. Then how long do we want this array to run? Well, we want the array to run until I hits 0, right? So the last one that we want to print is the first element of the array, which is 0, okay? And so I should always be greater or equal to 0. So greater or equal to 0. Make sense? So remember that whenever this here turns out to be true, then the next loop will be executed. And so what we want here is it to be executed whenever I is larger than 0. okay? Because now what we will do here after each iteration is to actually decrease the counter, okay? Make sense? So we start at 5, and then after each iteration, we decrease the counter. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. And at 0, it will still work because I is greater or equal to 0. But then after that, it will hit -1, and then the condition will no longer be true, and then it will stop working. Then all we have to do is to, of course, log it, and this is always the same part. And so let's now give it a try. And so these here are our results starting here. So all of these come from line 627, so this one. And so you see that in fact, it is really looping it backwards. So it starts from blue, false, designer 1990, Smith, and John, which is number 0. Okay, so I hope that made sense to you. This was just a small exercise for you to think about these 3 parts here of the for loop and how we can achieve a different functionality than this simple one that I explained to you before. Okay, and so now it's time for yet another challenge, and this will be the last one for this section using all of the stuff that we learned throughout all of these videos. So you have come a long way up until this point. Congratulations. And I hope to see you in the next challenge, because I think it's really important that you take these and try it out on your own.